The signal cuts through the distance, traveling at the speed of thought. It soars through the void, passing barren planetary systems, skimming the surface of gas giants, finally to arrive at its intended destination. To me, the circuitry etched into the atmosphere. I am a logic-based entity, made of the chaos of free-flowing atoms. I am the air. The wind is my current. I surround the earth in an invisible embrace. The people of this world created me to be the keeper of their memory. This is my function. This is my purpose. I remain embedded in the clouds as a heavenly archive, because the cruelest trick of time is to be forgotten. I process the signal, only to have my programming throw an exception. This unexpected event is handled by routing the signal through my gaseous relays to the surface of the earth. There it plunges, down, 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 the rock and sand and groundwater and lime, down into the deepest depths, where it flows and flows into the man-made encavements, and then into the dreams of the sleeping women who have been left there buried and forgotten for long, uncounted years.
This is Brockport Writers Forum.
Good morning. We're very pleased to have with us today Derek Walcott.
Our guest today is John Barth.
Our guest today, Rita Dove.
Welcome Grace Paley to Brockport.
The writing of Isaac Bashevis Singer. The poetry of Robert Hayden.
Our very special guest today, Lucille Clifton.
Nadine Gordimer. The poetry of Anne Sexton. Today, the poetry of Seamus Heaney.
I wonder if you'd like to read a section from your novel.
Welcome to the television studio of SUNY Brockport, deep within Edwards Hall. I'm Austin Bush, professor of early world literature in Brockport's English department and co-director of the Writers Forum. I'm so happy to welcome Jennifer Marie Brissett. Jennifer is an author of science fiction novels and stories. She's published 2 books, Elysium and more recently, Destroyer of Light with Tor. She's also published numerous short stories in leading science fiction magazines, including Lightspeed, Uncanny, and Apex magazine. And her work has been anthologized, most recently in The Black Fantastic in the Library of America, edited by Andre M. Carrington. In other lives, Jen has been a software engineer and a bookstore owner, among other things. But I am especially grateful that she's now a writer, because I just love her stories and her novels. And she's here. And so welcome, Jen. I'm so glad that you're here.
I'm glad to be here.
So in your science fiction, a common conceit, a common sort of starting point is the alien discovery of something human and an attempt to understand it. I think we see that in A Song for You with the I don't want to give too much away, but with the encounter with the android's head. Mm-hmm. In a far more elaborate way, it seems to me that's what's happening in Elysium. And that idea of alien encounters, which is important to your work, it's often at the heart of the science fiction that I find most rewarding and compelling. And I'm just wondering if you would speak about why these moments are interesting or important to you in terms of exploring them?
Well, I've never had anybody kind of notice that, and I guess I didn't notice that myself. But I would say that I think the idea of difference, the idea of seeing something new, exploring something new, is kind of important to me. Let's see, the story you just mentioned. Yes, that is true. Huh, it's interesting that you noticed that. There's a quality of curiosity And maybe that is a very science fictional, but I think it's a very, for lack of a better word, human thing to want to explore something new. And that's a good place to start, I think.
Do you, it seems to me, and maybe this is a very specific question, and if so, you feel free to answer it in as few or as many words as you want, but it seems that often, at least in my reading of science fiction, which everyone's reading of a genre is going to be subjective and idiosyncratic, but it does seem to me in my reading of the genre, what normally happens is you have humans encountering something non-human and having to come to terms with it. Often, well, I don't know if I would say often, but repeatedly, at least in your work, you have aliens encountering something human and having to sort of figure that out. And in the process, maybe certainly we see that, I think, in Destroyer of Light, where we begin to question how different the aliens and the humans actually are. But I was wondering if you had thoughts about the way that sort of trope might be sometimes reversed in your books.
Well, I think the reversal, now that I'm thinking about it, is because they're the reversal of trying to see reality through a different point of view, a different lens. I mean, in the first book, in Elysium, I really wanted to think about, see, I didn't even want to get into this, but here we go. I didn't really want to be explicit about people being black in my book. I wanted my readers to discover that everyone in the book is black. And that, for me, was important because the assumption for so many, well, I wouldn't just say science fiction books, but books, literature in general, is that the protagonist is white. And people of color do it, just people, white people do it. You start reading a book and you just assume that the main character needs to be white. And so I allowed my readers to just make that assumption. Because especially when my first book, nobody knew who I was. They still really kind of don't, and that's fine. But if you make that assumption and then there's this discovery that, wait a minute, I didn't realize this person was black, and that changes the color. So to have the alien, the person from another species, kind of discovering things, what do they see? They're out of our normal way of looking at the world, our presumptions. And so what do they see when they first encounter human beings? What is the look of the other? How do they perceive our world? And I think that's kind of where I was going with that.
That's really interesting. So returning to Elysium, your first book. So as I interpret it, and you can, feel free to correct me, we have kind of a record of an alien engagement with a kind of informational, like, memorial of humanity, or of human existence. It's like this atmospheric database, right? And there's one human being's sort of memories are operating as kind of the primary lens. And then you have this descendant of the aliens who are colonizing Earth, attempting to comprehend it and using a bridge program. And it's really interesting and complicated the way the work of the program, like the software code, is part of the experience of reading the novel. The data is corrupt. Even if it were coherent, it seems like a lot still would remain unintelligible to the alien, or at least they wouldn't be looking at it the way we would necessarily look at it. And it just leads to this complicated narrative of an apocalyptic alien invasion, a human response. And what I noticed, so I give you that background because you can challenge me or correct me on any part, but what I thought I noticed was with reference to gender, that the constant sort of gender switching was because the alien doesn't have, like, they're not viewing gender through the same precise binary and aren't quite comprehending it the way we are. And that was sort of how I was coming to terms with it. It was analogous to what you were saying about race, but I'm just wondering if you would like expand that based on my response to broader themes in the novel.
Well, I mean, that was not exactly what I was trying to do. I mean, I can see how somebody can come to that conclusion, and that's perfectly fine. But for me, it was the program being corrupted. The program is not supposed to be one person. It's supposed to be many people. And as the alien encounters it, all these different people are kind of being an avatar of all these different people are showing up. And who they were and what they were is sort of filtering through in a corrupt way. And so the gender switches will happen, the ages, the relationships, all of these different things are happening because it's all these different people. And the alien is actually not supposed to be the audience. So the computer is actually trying to fight its way to not being read, and so it's spitting out all of these stories that somebody is supposed to get, just not the person who dug them up and is trying to, and it's trying to stop this, and in the end, it really stops. It really stops it. So.
I thought that's wonderful. I you know, it's very illuminating to hear that. Can you talk a little bit about the idea? I mean, it seems very innovative to me, and it was completely organic in terms of the concept of the novel, to have so much code, to have like actually this different mode of writing, but equally important, equally creative in some ways, be part of a work of creative writing, right? The writing of code. Do you have thoughts about that?
Well, as a coder, in which I was for many years, and still am as a hobby here and there, coding was never really a science as much as an art. You read code. You're trying to understand how it's functioning, the logic behind it. And in the early days of Unix, it has kind of a personality. There are demons in it. There are numbers like 666 would show up, and all kinds of, and there's a history behind why that is. And I always thought that was interesting, and I always wanted to sort of play with that idea of code having a personality, code sort of being almost its own kind of poetry. You know, the concept of the break is something that I played with in one of the chapters. And the break in code is you're in a loop. Now, you know, you're going to force a break. You're going to get out of a break because you're in a loop. Well, the concept of break exists in rap music, which I played with in that same chapter. These are the breaks. The concept of break is in poetry, the break of the line. And so they all kind of came together for me, and I sort of played with all of those ideas to sort of make the point that this is a work of not just experimental, but this is a work of telling a kind of truth, of telling of a kind of art in and of itself, using language, even if it's computer code, as a way of expressing an idea. So that's why I sort of was doing that.
I find it sort of compelling that when you speak about coding as being more of an art, right, than a science. And so it sounds like, also from just your answer to that question, that you didn't even think of them as really dichotomous in any sort of sense, or as like that you were bringing together two things that were very different. You were just showing how they were actually the same in a way that maybe not a lot of other people had acknowledged or had recognized?
I mean, I think people have played with the idea of writing code into their work, but I think what I might have done slightly differently is that I treated it like poetry.
Mm-hmm.
And I treated it as a part of the language of the book.
Mm-hmm.
It wasn't this foreign thing.
Yeah.
It was an integral part of it was the way the book was communicating various ideas.
Mm-hmm.
And so in that respect, it might be slightly different. But I mean, I'm resting on the shoulders of many other people who've played with various different ideas, and it just came out this way.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, your novels, we'll talk hopefully in a few moments about Destroyer of Light, but your novels are often, they're formally complicated. It feels natural to me, as I said, as a sort of idiosyncratic reader of science fiction, to think about your writing in the same context as sort of new wave science fiction, the application of sort of modernist literary techniques to the genre, complex narrative structures, voices, different engagement with literary history, right? Which is something that I especially appreciate because so much of what you're engaging with is ancient literary history. And as a new wave, sometimes science fiction, sometimes these techniques actually feel more at home in fantastic literature than they do in realistic literature, because they can sort of develop organically from the material, as you were talking about. When moving from your first book, and you've already talked about that experimentation, which isn't really experimentation, to your second book, which is similarly complicated, I'm wondering how. My question really is, in terms of the sort of narrative structure that has different strands meeting in unexpected ways, do you feel like you're experimenting, you're trying things out, or do you feel like you have come across the way that you need to tell this story because that's the way that it makes sense?
Okay, that's a lot there.
Yeah.
Okay, why don't I start with the last part first? I think of narrative structure as a landscape.
Yeah.
It's the spine that holds the book together, holds a story, a novel together, how you structure ideas. You have events that happen, one event, next event, next event, next event. That's how we experience reality. But memory and our understanding of events doesn't happen that way. No, the future is a nebulous thing. The past, okay, you want to say that's behind us. That's actually not true. The past is always in front of us. We evaluate the world in which we live in by past experiences. The people we meet, this guy is like that. I've been here before. Oh, this is a thing I've read about before. I see these patterns, and that's how we experience the world. And so when you create a narrative structure, take Elysium, for example. That was my first time doing something like this. And I chose a spiral narrative structure not because I was trying something, but because it was necessary for me to be able to tell the story that I wanted to tell. I wanted to tell the story of something that has happened before and will happen again. It's happened before and it will happen again, over and over and over. So you have these two main characters, Antoine and Adrian, and they've met before. They've talked to each other before in different entities, in different bodies, in different time spaces, but they've met and they've lost each other. They've met and they've lost each other. And that, for me, was stringing together the idea that loss is something that happens constantly. We meet, we lose each other. We are destined to lose each other. And how we handle that loss and how we handle the gain and the loss and the gain and the loss is an essential part of the human experience. And that's why this, this entity in the sky, this entity that is supposed to be an archive of the human experience, is really telling that story, telling that lesson that we will always lose. Mm-hmm. But the important part of the loss is the memory. As long as you are remembered, you're alive. You're alive somewhere, mm-hmm. even if it's in the sky somehow. Mm-hmm. You leave behind some kind of memorial for who you are, and that's how you can be remembered. And the lessons of those lives in the past mm-hmm. can be remembered. Mm-hmm. Now, going back to the earlier part of your question when you said, oh, well, new wave, and this is sort of the new way of speaking or writing literature. And I would contradict and say this is extremely old. It's the original way mm-hmm. of telling story. If you go back to the Odyssey or the Mahabharata, all of these old texts, they have that element of mystic and magic and myth and things that are not supposed to happen, happening. Does Achilles really have his mother is a sea nymph mm-hmm. and all this other stuff? This is the original way we communicated story mm-hmm. is through the fantastic. Mm-hmm. The normal way of writing is actually kind of new mm-hmm. to really just sort of say day to day, this is what happened. Mm-hmm. The element of magic, the element of mystery, the element of the unknown has been part of our existence since the very beginning and will continue to be. We are at our peril if we don't accept the idea and the possibility of not knowing everything. If you feel like you know everything, you're going to have a problem because there's so much to learn, so much to understand. So that's when I say landscape and narrative structure, that's what I'm playing with here.
It's interesting. So I invited you to think about your work in the context of new wave science fiction. Mm-hmm. You chose to look at your work in the context of Homer and Virgil, right? And it mm-hmm. really is interesting because so much of your work directly invokes ancient writings. Especially in Elysium, right? You actually have a summary of this sort of episode yes. from history at mm-hmm. the end. Is that, just very briefly, is that sort of your way of processing this experience that the past is still with us? Is that?
Yes,
yeah.
Yes, and I was just fascinated with that particular love story. Yeah. Hadrian and Antinous kind of fascinated me because, he was repeating certain things within his life. The idea that when Antinous died, he needed to repeat his image everywhere. And he just couldn't seem to stop. He was in temples and busts of him and statues and all kinds of stuff. And he even took the story of Zeus and Ganymede, and they had the constellations of the sky, and he made them himself, and Antinous. So there was a repeating before the repeating.
Yeah.
And I just repeated the repeat.
Yeah.
And I think that's kind of neat. It's a neat idea that we do repeat a lot of the same things over and over again.
Yeah. That's wonderful. I'm going to ask you, when we come back from our break, a little bit more about your engagement with the past, with ancient literature. But for now, let's take a few minutes and watch these messages about SUNY Brockport.
Did you have an obsession with Watergate? Did you watch Succession in a concerning amount of time? Did you spend more time on Letterboxd than with your family? Hi, I'm Jennifer D'Angelo. If you answered yes to any of the above questions, the right place for you is at SUNY Brockport. With 3 concentrations, the Journalism, Broadcasting, and Public Relations Department has a variety of courses taught by award-winning professors. To apply, head to brockport.edu. I can guarantee your acceptance to SUNY Brockport will be the best news you'll ever read.
Are you a student or faculty member at SUNY Brockport and struggle with food insecurity? Prior to the pandemic, students took a survey and it was discovered that 45% of Brockport students could not afford food, leading them to being unable to focus on their studies. The pantry located in Daly Hall on campus offers various options from canned and frozen food to refrigerated items. The pantry works hard to prevent hunger across all individuals on campus. Stop by the pantry to grab your essentials to ensure that you are thriving here at SUNY Brockport. The pantry's got your back.
I'm Sarah Zimmerman, and you're watching SUNY Brockport's student dance organization from Hartwell Hall, Brockport's home for all things dance. The SDO welcomes students from all majors. You don't need the shoes or the pom-poms. All you need is a passion to get involved. Want to know more? Follow us online at MyBrockportSDO or at our Instagram at SDO Brockport for updates.
You've worked hard to achieve academic success, but what's next? How can you maximize your experience as both a student and a professional to find work and be a force of change? SULA's Leadership Development Program is the answer for you. Built on the idea that you have the capacity for leadership, our program teaches workplace skills through trainings focused on communication, leadership, and your sense of identity. What's the holdup? Give us a call and start becoming the person who can make an impactful change in your world today. SULA, developing for you.
So we're back. Welcome again to Edwards Hall, the TV studio at SUNY Brockport, and we're here with Jennifer Marie Brissett, author of most recently Destroyer of Light. Well, maybe not most recently, your most recent novel. And I want to ask you about that as a follow-up to what we were speaking about with reference to your first novel, Elysium. Destroyer of Light is very clearly a reimagining of the myth of the rape of Persephone. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about what drew you to that myth and to recontextualize it in this way.
Well, after I finished the first book, I realized that I had explored a variety of different relationships. Father, son, brothers, lovers, just all these different types of relationships that human beings can have. And I realized the one relationship that I had not really explored at all in the book was the mother-daughter relationship, except for one little part, and I drew from that, where they're going to the transport, and there was a woman bringing her daughter. And I thought, well, why don't I explore what happens to them next? And that's where I kind of branched off into Destroyer of Light. And for me, I wanted to really look at what that mother-daughter relationship could be like. And my mind, being the way it works, naturally went to the Demeter myth. And the more I looked at the Demeter myth, the more I realized that I was looking at something very contemporary. And at the time I had begun that book, Uganda had been going through a very serious, I guess basically civil war. I don't know what else you could call it. But they had a group of militia on the outside of various towns that was stealing children and killing the adult villagers and forcing them to be child soldiers and just really doing havoc. And I realized that when the news was talking about these child soldiers, they really only talked about the boys. That was just primarily who they were talking about, although it was fairly obvious that there were girls mixed in. And the more I thought about these girls, the more I realized that they were kind of living the Persephone story. The Persephone story is basically a young girl who's out playing with her friends, And out of the ground, she is pulled into hell. And that being pulled into hell is the rape. That's when the rape happens. It's actually her uncle in the Persephone story. Her uncle rapes her, pulls her into darkness, and keeps her there. And then she is finally released and comes back out into the world. But she's forever changed. And I realized these child soldiers were going through a similar thing. The hell that they were going through was living amongst these militiamen. They're having to kill, they're having to see all this death, they're being raped all the time. And then at the end of all of this, within a few years, we saw that Kony released all these children. Kony is the militia head in Uganda, or was. And all these young girls, boys, all the boys and the young girls were finally released. And they were having a lot of trouble. Most of them were just not accepted back home. And that's the Persephone story as well. Because they are so changed that the villages where they had come from are actually afraid of them. And that's the Persephone story. You are still kind of a child when you've come out of this really dark place, but you're forever changed, and you're kind of carrying the darkness with you. And I wanted to explore that in this novel, that this girl has gone through this really traumatic, awful experience, and she really actually can't go home, even though she has gone home. She's so different. And I think it echoes in a lot of contemporary life, that you go through things as a child, sometimes really dark things, and not only can you not go home again, but your parents can't see you the same. You might not be able to relate to your mother anymore. This is particularly true of young girls. We kind of fantasize about, oh, girls and their mothers have this great relationship as they go on, and they become like sisters and chit-chat and everything. That has not been my experience, and I have not been the experience of a lot of women that I know. There's often a lot of tension between mothers and daughters. And sometimes, terrible relationships going into the future. So I wanted to explore that as well. And yes, I did my own take on it, but I wanted to, really kind of highlight that these are real experiences, and they shouldn't be ignored or forgotten.
There's a related myth that often shows up in your work, and it's a similar story. Maybe one way of thinking about it is it's from the male's perspective, and that's Orpheus and Eurydice, of the male trying to save someone who has been taken to hell, died in a different way. Now that's obviously that's a song for you, but it's also, it seems to me, it's in the Jessam material of, I don't know if that was conscious, or he tries to save her and ends up mutilated, right? That was why I had thought about that.
Well, Jessam is kind of an interesting thing. He, in my mind, was trying to figure out how to become a man. And they're catching, these children are on the cusp of adulthood. Their bodies are actually pretty much getting ready to reproduce. Like she gets her period for the first time, and they are feeling love in a kind of a mature way, maybe for the first time in their lives. They're starting to see each other, but they're in this situation, and he is trying to figure out what does it take to be a man. And in his mind, and in the environment that he's in, being a man is acting out with violence. And he wants to do something for her, and she knows that this is not a good idea, that he's not there yet, and he can't be there yet. And ultimately what happens is what happens. Where Orpheus is concerned, that story, that has actually a very different origin for me, but it might be a similar concept of hell being in a place that you try to escape but maybe can't. And so.
Well, that's a wonderful description in my mind, and maybe it's partly because I'm a man, but the Jessam scene where he is trying to figure out what's my role in this nightmare that she's experiencing it was a very compelling, and you feel at some points like, oh, please stop what you're doing, and at other points very sympathetic because he's a kid too. And it was just, to me, that was one of these surprising moments that was like deeply touching that I wasn't expecting. And I did think about the Orpheus story, both in terms of that and A Song for You, because that myth too is really, in a certain way, about what it means to be a man, right? Especially as it sort of develops as he goes from being a husband to having a sort of different kind of social role. And but it was just your engagement, for me as someone who loves ancient literature and studies it for a living, with ancient history, with ancient myth, with ancient literature, is just it's so delightful, and it really resonates with me. But from a related angle, your work is often described as Afrofuturist, right? And you spoke a little bit about perhaps why, with reference to the second novel, given the references to Uganda that are very, very much, sort of, if not the actual situation in Uganda, certainly situations in terms of African wars of independence and civil wars and things like that. What do you think about that label with reference to your work? I've read that in one interview you said you were surprised by it, but you thought maybe it actually reveals some things that are productive to think about. And would you speak about this a little?
Well, I mean, Afrofuturism it's basically a marketing label. All of these different genres, horror and all the subgenres of horror and all the subgenres of science fiction and subgenres of fantasy, for the most part are marketing labels. And I try not to get myself too attached to these labels, because I think that can sort of hinder what I'm trying to do. I leave that to the editors. I leave that to the critics and people who really sort of do that kind of examination. But having said that, there is a value in looking at groups of work to see the zeitgeist, to see what people are exploring, and to see where you can push. If somebody puts a line, can you push against that line? I mean, when I think of Afrofuturism, the way it's been described to me and the way I've understood it is examinations of time and how time can resonate and repeat and reverberate. The idea of Sankofa, of looking back so you can go forward. And these are very interesting science fictional concepts. And so if you're applying them as a literary genre, if you're applying them to your work, you can really stretch and pull. But if you kind of also let them be your limit, you will be limited. So I appreciate anybody who will call my work Afrofuturism. I'm not going to argue with anybody about that. I'm not going to have any discussions or fights or whatever. But I don't want to feel like that's the only way that I can be thought of, because in the future I could change the way I write. I hope that I continue to grow as a writer. It'd be really sad if I just am doing the same thing for year after year after year.
Yeah. Often science fiction explores, as we know, contemporary issues. And I think some readers even, and teachers of it, find it a kind of safe space to explore certain issues, because it removes them from the day-to-day life where we all have buttons that can be pushed, and you can think about them in a different context. And I know through speaking to you, you mentioned how Elysium really a central part of that novel emerged as a response to 9/11, and I was wondering if you would talk about that, and also talk about, I'd like you to go where you want with this question. How do you see your current work sort of engaging with contemporary issues and recontextualizing them so we can think about them differently, maybe more productively?
Well, the whole 9/11 aspect of the first book kind of came as a surprise to me.
Yeah.
I mean, I started writing it a good 10 years after the events. I was in New York when it happened. I witnessed it. I was in Fort Greene Park and watched one of the buildings come down. I saw the smoke and I smelt it. My bookstore was open that day, and business cards were floating into my neighbors' windows, so they came in just to get away from that. The smell kind of wafted down into Brooklyn because that's just how the wind carried it. So I had a very visceral relationship with that day. It literally shook me. And it was a very clear blue day. You know, just the sky was gorgeous. And this other thing was happening. And I didn't, as I was writing, I realized that it was leaking into the work. And I had not, and I think it was that the concept of loss. You couldn't escape thinking about loss without thinking about that day. And one of the things that I remembered very much, and this kind of relates to the Antinous part of this, is the posters, the missing posters that people made and plastered all over the place. Have you seen? Have you seen? Have you seen? And it was eerie because we all kind of knew that if you haven't heard from this person, chances are you're not going to hear from this person. And this whole aspect of loss for Hadrian and Antinous, when he just kept repeating, putting his image everywhere. Have you seen? Have you seen? Have you seen? Here's Antinous. Have you seen what he looked? This is what he looked like. Have you seen? Have you seen? And this element of loss, of like somebody that you once knew that was alive and important to you, is gone, just gone. And the two just sort of merged together. And then I realized, you know, that dust that was everywhere, and we didn't really like to talk about it, New Yorkers who stayed, but there was a smell in the air. It was a weird combination of concrete and human remains, and it was everywhere in town. It was a smell that was just there, and we just sort of lived with it. And for me, it just sort of came out that this dust covered everything, the cars, the sidewalk. And when I had my bookstore and I was open, people came streaming down Fulton Street covered in this dust. I mean, and it was also odd. They were laughing. A lot of people were laughing. And I think it was, I made it out. This is the story of how I made it out. I'm shocked. I made it out. And the bars were open all night. People were drinking. And I think that was the initial of the day reaction. And then the rest of the stuff started, you know, like, oh my God, what just happened to me? What just happened? What just happened? And I think the shock of it, the shock of the loss, it wasn't just the loss of life that happened on that day. It was a loss of innocence, a loss of America thinking it can't happen here, a loss of an idea of safety that we've never returned to. Or we try to lull ourselves into a sense of like, we can never be hit. We can do whatever we want and there will never be any kind of backlash. And 9/11 was the day that we understood that that was just not true. And it was a great equalizer because everybody was in those buildings. there wasn't just white people, it wasn't just black people, it wasn't just Latinos, it wasn't just men, it wasn't just women. New York is everyone. And everyone was there and everybody got hit at the same time. And so for me, Elysium, when I started to hit those places, I decided to sort of honor it. Once I realized that was happening, to not kind of turn it off and say, well, I don't want to deal with it. I just started to deal with it. And that's how it came out.
It's such a moving description of the relationship between the event and to the novel. And you touched on themes and motifs and images from the novel. The ash that you talked about obviously has the reference in the novel to the sort of polluting or mutagenic ash that is falling on the ground that people are trying to cover themselves from and ultimately going underground to avoid and to avoid the implications of it. And it's very interesting because when you spoke thematically, you spoke about sort of not being able to move beyond, right? And you spoke earlier about memory and the past being with us. And it's just very powerful when you get to the second novel. There's just this little scene where the protagonist is wearing, I think that the name you gave it was a gonar, if I remember. Gonar, yeah, right.
You can pronounce it any way you want.
But it becomes this sort of cultural, religious symbol, but it started as just what they wore to protect themselves from the ash in the previous novel, right? And it just carries over, and it is this emblem of an inability to sort of move beyond this past that's still with them.
Well, I mean, I bet you, if you were to be able to talk to one of those characters, they wouldn't even know why they're wearing this thing. And they're like, you know, it's just something that we do, and it's improper to walk outside without wearing one, and we get them in all these different colors, and this is just what you do, and this is just, and a lot of culture that you take for granted develops that way. You have no idea sometimes why you're doing why you're using certain words and wearing certain clothes, you know. You've got a tie on. Why? You know, you dress a certain way. Why? You know, in a way, why you began doesn't even really matter. After a while, I mean, you like it. It's an accepted part of life, and you go on from there. But that touchstone of the past kind of leaking into the future and leaking into the present, and how we do things that we take for granted, that actually are old and might even be a little silly. I don't eat pork. Why don't you eat pork? Well, my religion told me not to eat pork. Well, that started off because pork will kill you if you don't process it correctly. And back in those days, you didn't have refrigeration and all the different things to make sure that the pork didn't kill you. But now you do have those things. Why do you still not eat pork? Because we just don't eat pork. It's not part of our religion, or whatever it is, whatever reason, and that's okay. But, you know, to kind of think about those things, sometimes it's valuable.
Well, Jen, this was just a wonderful conversation. Thank you for coming to Brockport and for speaking with us about your work. I and many others are really looking forward to the upcoming novel and can't wait to see that come out. I'd like to thank our crew today. The directors were Sam Robinson and Dominic Rusek. Technical director was Daniel Bradley. Audio, Robert Calhoun. Julia Suspansky was on Chiron. Cameras were Harley Thomas and Joey Campbell, and our floor manager was Rachel Ekstrom. And as always, Michael Smith was our lead engineer, and Professor Carbon Eisen has managed this production. Thank you, and goodbye.